Masa, it's a great pleasure to be able to speak with you today. Thank you very much for inviting me here to this rooftop garden. We're actually right in the middle of Tokyo. Can you say a little bit about where we are?
Yeah, welcome to my garden, or our garden, on top of Roppongi Hills building. As you may know, Roppongi is one of the very crowded city in Tokyo, and we are here right on top of the sixth level building. And just at the side, we have famous Roppongi Hills skyscraper, which is a symbolic building in Tokyo. And we are on the rooftop, but we have like 1 meter depth of healthy soil here. Because we have a lot of earthquake in Japan, we need to put some counterweight on top of the buildings, and that's one of the example. So we are using this soil weight as to counterbalance the shaking of earthquake. And on it, we introduced many edible plant species in a way that we call synecculture. And here is the example. And it's now in beginning of April. So just a new seeds started to germinate, and we see some remaining of flowers. That's where we are.
Let's take a closer look at the garden later on. But first of all, I think I should say congratulations to you because you've just established a company.
Yes.
So what's the name of the company, and tell me about why you established it?
Oh, sure. The new company is called Syneco Inc., and it's a new Sony company. So Sony funded from their environmental fund that they recently established, and we are the first investment for this fund. And the reason is that I've been doing research, especially in basic scientific approach on this kind of how to establish ecosystem and how to make use of this eleval ecosystem for food production for over 10 years. And we have a lot of successful cases in Africa and in some fields in Japan. But it was still in the research scientific project. And then as the situation is rapidly changing concerning the biodiversity loss, we had a recent outbreak of coronavirus, for example. That's one of the very symptomatic example of what's going to happen if we continue to lose biodiversity. And we believe that it is time to scale out our project, including the business. So it's not a simple challenge to make another Sony company and be successful in terms of business. It's rather like a fundamental challenge to reestablish the way we interact with the ecosystem and to how we can reconstruct the biodiversity through our essential daily activities and make business on top of that. So it's more than just making a successful company. It's more like how we can re-establish the fundamental mechanism of economy to be linked with the augmentation of biodiversity.
So tell me, what does Syneco actually mean?
Well, Syneco literally is like ecology together. So it has several implications, for example. But originally, the term synecology is coming from 19th century's Swiss botanist who defined the term synecology, actually. At that time, there was, of course, a big domain called ecology. That's nowadays we still use it. And those people divided the term ecology into two issues. One is autoecology. So it's like one species interacting with the environment. So it's like a bit monoculture like setting. And synecology is just like here. Many species are interacting each other with very ever-changing environment. So that's a very complex system. So I kind of revived this old terminology, synecology, and to put it as a kind of new name for our project and what we are doing here.
If we just look at this garden as people who haven't seen this garden before, it looks like it's overgrown with weeds. There's no structure to it whatsoever. What has this got to do with agriculture?
Very good point is that when we perceive things, we need to put some words or some, conceptual image on that. And we just don't have other image than monoculture. Finally established a single crop culture for fruit production, and simply because we have much more experience on that. But before we have like hunting gathering period, like more than 10,000 years ago, and there's a rich forest full of edible species. So the definition of edible is something very fuzzy, because at that time everything could be edible. Also, well, the toxic plant could serve as medicinal use. For example, if we lessen the dose, for example, it's kind of reconceptualizing what is edible here. What is the optimization of making edible biomass, in a sense, if we put in a scientific term, is that things like this fava plant that generally we perceive as weed is also edible. So you can also taste flowers, and you can eat the new leaves if you boil it, for example, and only if you want. And then other species, this is completely a cultivar, and this one as well. So making no visible structure doesn't necessarily mean it's not productive. It's more like it's relying on the self-organizing dynamics of ecosystem. So it's just like natural edible forest here. So it's true that at the first sight, people lose sight of actually what's going on here. But after careful explication, and especially the experience of interaction with this complex field, people start to realize that, oh, there's a very high edible biomass here, or this would be edible in 2 weeks, or this would be accessible for other purposes, including harvest in 3 months and so on. They got a lot of information. So
let's just quick look at some of the one or two examples of plants that people will be familiar with as sources of food for their table. So what is this? This is a broad bean?
Yeah, it's kind of bean. Yeah, kind of broad bean, yeah.
Yeah. And then you were talking about that one back there. That's
It's a small cabbage. So
small cabbage.
yeah, it's just surviving as it is because we didn't put any fertilizer.
So that's another key point, isn't it? That the inputs are kept to a minimum?
Yeah, it's not the conception of minimum. It's rather a conception of what is really necessary and what is not. Because in ecosystemic sense, they don't require any input for natural organization because, plants can photosynthesize and make organic matters. And they also attract other animals, insects, to make to augment the fertility of soil, actually. And we are doing the same mechanism. And this mechanism has been studied in ecology, but not necessarily in agronomy. Yeah.
So you were talking about this, what normally people would regard as a weed. It's until today, I very much regarded it as a weed because I see it in my garden at home. But then you said I can actually eat the flower, which I tried just now. And I'm going to have another one because it was actually very good. It's quite sweet, isn't it?
It's a drop of honey inside.
A drop of honey. Oh, so it's got nectar in it. Yeah. And it is very good. It just hadn't occurred to me before that I could actually put it in my mouth and eat it. Okay, so how do you harvest from a patch like this?
Yeah, we are doing thinning harvest. So basically we have the mixed association of edible plants. And as it grows bigger, it may disturb other plants. So we do the thinning. At the same time, it's the harvesting. So this one is still in small stage. So we are not doing harvest. Maybe only this flower part because we want to make it grow bigger. So we just cut the flower so it doesn't end its life by making seed. So we say stop, don't make seed. You can still grow. And yeah, it's we need to treat a very high diversity, and each plant has its own context. And that's a very complex system. But in total, from this kind of massive portfolio of diversity, we may be able to have sufficient harvest out of it. And we are experimenting in other places. This is a demonstration. Yeah.
So your company isn't going to be immediately profitable by planting fields like this. So how do you see things moving forward business-wise?
Well, the thing that we have to overcome to manage this kind of highly complex systems is the information or literacy that we have in our mind. For example, when facing this complex field, some people would think it's useless, or for some people, it's a kind of treasure. Yeah, like the example of Kew Garden in London. It used to be a reservoir of plant genetic resources in 19th century, and now it's more like active plant genetic resources that is producing food and also adapting to climate change and regaining topsoil to suppress global diseases and so on. So we can yield this kind of long-term benefit if we manage biodiversity. But all these things need the prior knowledge, or maybe the knowledge to interact with this complex field. And the new company is just trying to start to provide platform for this acquisition of literacy, or to accompany with other stakeholders who wish to take the same trajectory as we are trying to do, and try to share the experiences, try to share the database, or probably give the analysis using artificial intelligence, so that to enrich our experience and our literacy to cope with this complexity of ecosystem.
So in order to be able, you're using the word literacy, to pursue that metaphor, to be able to read what's going on in this space, normally I think in other locations you would have cameras directed at the field so that you can actually monitor visually, for example, what's going on. And then you're gathering visual data and you're able to process that visual data. Tell me a little bit about that process.
Oh, sure. Well, usually AI companies try to handle many digital data, including image, sound, and probably smell, chemical sensors, and so on. But our starting point is rather humans, because we are aiming for sustainability. So you can just make a simple comparison, using simple imagination, like taking hundreds of pictures and trying to yield the information using artificial intelligence, or just talking to children that this plant may be edible, and this plant it's not. It may be toxic, but it's medicinal use. And imagine how these children will grow up in 5 years later on, for example. And that's something we call literacy. It's inside of human. So we may use supportive technologies using the image to identify plants, for example, but it doesn't replace our first-hand experience to manage the ecosystem. So what we do is to provide the scientific basis or principles of how the plants are interacting with animals and making topsoil, and what is the function of topsoil, for example, and try to interpret this principle in each one's location, for example, and provide necessary support for the interpretation. Yeah, so it's more primitive, much more primitive than the artificial intelligence, but it comes to the heart of the very first-person experience when facing the ecosystem. And the difference from traditional knowledge is that we are treating many species and many ecosystems equally, because we are facing the change in social change, economic change, and climate change, which may disturb more or less our social and ecological organization. Then we don't know what kind of traditional knowledge would survive, or what kind of new knowledge we have to create. So we are very trying to make flat information regarding the difference of species. So maybe some new edible species that never grew here could be a principal crop, for example, here. So we are trying to treat this kind of massive new knowledge that is susceptible for future adaptation.
So if one of the key things here is actually to get hands-on again with the environment around us. And I'm sure that it's not only humans that want to get hands-on with an environment like this. In the Japanese countryside, there are many pests. What, for example, would you say about a field like this in terms of protecting itself from those pests?
Yeah, that's a very deep question. I mean, the wording of pest has several level of implications. So it's true that monoculture method is very vulnerable to pests, especially to insect pests, first of all. So they need to use chemicals. And at that level, this synecculture field is very robust. And it doesn't mean there's no pest species. I mean, there are many insect species that belong to the category of pest in usual farming method. But in our farm, it's just a part of ecosystems. And it may just eat a bit of these leaves, but it never causes massive damage because they are well regulated under the food chain which is also established through the construction of an ecosystem. So at that level, we don't see negative impact, but rather positive effect of pollination, or even the quality of product. We did some phytochemical analysis of tea leaves, and there are a lot of phytochemicals that are beneficial to our health that is induced by the interaction with insects. So insects eat a little bit of these tea leaves, and then the plants genetically react, and express more of this health beneficial compounds. So we have a lot of invisible positive effect as well. And then in terms of farming, for example, we have wild boar, deer, and monkeys in Japanese countryside. And this depends, because we have some fields that were damaged by wild boar. That's for true. But not totally. It's kind of impossible to destroy totally this field, because we got so much diversity. It's literally impossible to wipe out. While in monoculture method, there's only a single crop, so it's quite easy to eat everything out. But here we need to play hide and seek game, actually. So that's making the situation more complex. And also the interesting thing is that for the birds, for example, I've talked about strawberry. Actually, we do put strawberries in this bush, and it makes fruits. And in usual monoculture field, there's birds coming down and eat everything out. But in our field, when there's some other plants, including something usually called weed, for example, birds by instinct suspect that there are some sort of snakes, or they are afraid of this, bushy situation. So as a consequence, the strawberry perfectly grow without pesticide, without the defense net against the bird. And that's a very beautiful example of more is different. Diversity is something very, there's a high synergy when high biodiversity are put together, and not necessarily high diversity is like hostile environment. Yeah.
What is the impact on the soil of growing plants like this?
That's one of the very interesting results in our project is that usually in any farming method, we talk about soil amelioration. So we put fertilizers or some minerals or other things like sand to ameliorate soil, which means we need to change the physical and chemical property of soil so that it could favor the growth of a particular crop. And that's true in a monoculture context. And in our context, it's totally different. We let the ecosystem grow in symbiosis and high diversity. And at the same time, we monitored the activity and biodiversity of soil microorganisms, so microbiota, and small organisms that are living in soil, and that is making the transfer of minerals and stimulating the growth of plant roots and so on. And it turned out that our field, after 1 year or 2 years of trial, the soil became very rich in this soil microorganisms at the level that exceed the normal monoculture field. So something that could not be easily achievable by doing artificial input could be naturally achieved by just associating like 200 edible species here. And that's a real network of nature, I believe. Yeah.
Talking about a positive impact on soil, I know that you have projects going in Africa where desertification is a big problem. What impact might this kind of approach have on desertification?
Yeah, that was one of the most significant results in our project is that I started this project in Japan, and to test what is the good point of associating so many excessive amount of diversity in one area. And the theory that I constructed is that it doesn't make much sense if the climate or soil condition is already favorable for the monoculture method, because in this kind of ecosystem we have also a lot of competition. So maybe for the simplicity of the agricultural management, monoculture method has of course lots of good points. But if it's in a very harsh environment, under drought, desertification, or no soil organic matters, monoculture method needs to be optimized with lots of cost. I mean, artificial inputs like fertilizer and water should evaporate immediately. So it's not very cost effective. But in such ecosystem-based method, although we need to do the initial input of plants, like 200 edible species in one place, and also we need to put for water, but no fertilizer, no agrochemicals, and water is just kept circulating at the surface level. And now the problem of desertification is that it's not the lack of precipitation. They have rainy season and dry season, and this variance is making huge damage on the topsoil because, as you can imagine, dry season, everything will die out. Then if the topsoil is not covered by the vegetation like this, during the rainy season, there's a heavy rainfall. So it wipes out the topsoil, and including the seed. So in the next dry season, there's no vegetation. So that's the principal vicious cycle of desertification. And to cope with that, we need to cover the ground. So before starting the monoculture, we need to set up, reestablish the ground cover and then the topsoil, and then recover the local ecosystem. Then at that stage, we may introduce for the first time monoculture method, but not before. So synecocculture is very good for re-establishing this first stage of succession, which was theoretically estimated from the experiment in Japan. But our experience in Africa was far beyond the expectation. So it worked more effectively and in small scale. Yeah.
Which countries in particular?
It started in Burkina Faso in 2015 with local NGO. And then looking at the success of that local project, there's a Burkina Faso government coming in, there's ECOWAS countries budget coming in, and so we have like several dozens of farms in many countries in the Sahel, including Mali and Togo, and starting from Burkina Faso.
So listening to everything you've been saying today, I've been seeking connections with what I do. You were saying playing hide and seek in the field here. I've been playing hide and seek in your conversation to try to identify things that resonate with what I've been doing. And I think that one of them is definitely monoculture. You were saying that what happens these days in terms of that cultural lack of diversity contributes even to the spread of a virus. What I've been thinking about in the countryside in Japan, which is where I do a lot of work, there's a culture of convenience which has been wiping out traditional expressions of culture in the countryside. And my concern has been, well, it's very, very difficult to stop the culture of convenience because it's convenient and we all enjoy its benefits.
In short term.
In the short term. Yeah. But when you encounter a problem like we've encountered over the past 12 months or so with the coronavirus, then suddenly the convenient city life becomes much less convenient again.
Yeah, it's like, like a jail. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have a feeling that the ways in which people were thinking and being and doing in the countryside in the old days may still have some very, very valuable lessons for us to learn. And it may not be possible to actually live like that any longer. But having experience of it, as you were saying, children going into an environment like this, they will have that memory that they can then refer to in their life moving forward. And I'd love to be able to make small villages in the Japanese countryside accessible to people who want to think about, well, what were these traditional values? How could we make use of these traditional ways of thinking in a modern lifestyle? So that's one thing that made a connection. And apart from anything else, again, is just how do we make the best possible use of the only time available to us to do anything, which is now.
Yeah.
And that's become the theme of this newsletter that I've started on Substack called Now How.
And there should be some positive value in the time of change. That's the other way of looking at things will make a kind of next step or a huge leap into making a new society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I could just say there that one thing that we're trying as a starting point is a little village shop, online village shop for this village in Yamagata that I do some work with. We call it Mai Shuraku, Nakatsugawa. Shuraku is the Japanese word for settlement. But what I'm hoping is that we can start linking up these little tiny dots in a network globally, a kind of community synecoculture, if you like, because we do have this great opportunity in the 21st century to communicate across cultural and national boundaries. But it seems to me that all we've been doing with it so far is just narrowing and narrowing and narrowing so that we all share exactly the same values. And some of those values are very, very good. But at the same time, there's all of this around us in the world. There are all of these different expressions. How do we actually harness the individual value in each expression around us so that everybody can, well, be themselves, ultimately? You've got a lot of business innovators watching this around the world. Can you think of any ways in particular that you would welcome some form of partnership with other people in other contexts?
There's really a lot of productive partnership. And in most cases, when I talk with a lot of CEO of companies, they are more far-sighted than scientists because they see the reality. They run the company, they can calculate money. Scientists cannot calculate money. And at the same time, they are more busy on how to properly run the company in a given framework, like in the economic system as it is now. And although they know that there's a future collapse of this very frail system, they don't know how to proceed. They don't know how to become fast penguin because they don't know the relationship with the biodiversity of the ecosystems or how the wild nature can be refined to eventually have connection to their business as well. So I want to make this kind of connection, of course, by our new company's service and products. But we gotta talk a lot of in a wider context, for example, because talking between two companies may not be plausible to solve any issues. But we have to make a global consortium in which many companies of many different levels can stick together and make a big arch of synergy. And that's where I'm expecting that we thrive together. Yeah.
Great. So you say the first penguin?
The first
Oh,
penguin.
I mean, like in the Antarctic, which one's going to jump in first?
Yeah, the kind
Okay,
of.
right, yeah. So please, people watching this, be the first penguin.